Just a temp. That's what they called her in the break room when Rachel Torres wasn't close enough to hear. Just a temp who'd work the graveyard shifts nobody wanted, ask no questions, disappear when daylight came. They didn't know her left hand had performed emergency cricothyrotomies on mountainsides in Sangin. They didn't know her official records had been erased by a Pentagon handler who told her, "You no longer exist in any database." What they saw was a woman in borrowed scrubs with her ID badge flipped backward, moving through Mercy General's corridors like a ghost learning to haunt a hospital instead of a battlefield. Rachel Torres arrived at 10:19 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, sliding into the employee locker room with the same efficiency she'd once used to kit up for pre-dawn operations. The locker assigned to her was number 43, the third from the corner where she could see the entrance without turning her head. She'd worked 17 temp shifts at Mercy General over 4 months, and she'd never once failed to position herself with an exit line. Old habits, the ones that kept people alive in Sangin, didn't die just because you wore a stethoscope instead of body armor. She hung her jacket on the hook, careful and slow, and pulled open the metal door. 3 items waited inside like sacred relics. A cracked mug with faded unit insignia that she'd bought from a gas station in Wilmington and touched once per shift without exception. A dying succulent she'd overwatered out of guilt, it had come with the locker and she couldn't bring herself to throw it out. And the boots. Combat boots, worn at the heel, creased at the toe, the leather the color of wet earth after rain. She didn't touch them. Not tonight. Not yet. The nurse manager had given her the assignment over email, trauma bay rotation, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., critical staffing shortage, standard temp rate. Rachel had accepted within 2 minutes, which was faster than she should have. Desperation was readable. But the bills from her efficiency apartment in South Raleigh didn't care about caution, and the military pension that should have come never materialized. The handler had been clear, your retirement was never funded. Your service record was archived. The cover story is that you washed out of a nursing program in 2022. Stick to it. So she washed dishes at 3 different restaurants, worked temp shifts at 2 hospitals, and kept her left thumb moving despite the tremor that had lived there since the IED detonation that ended her official existence. She changed into scrubs, standard blue, forgettable, the kind no one remembered 5 minutes after seeing them, and clipped a temporary badge to her pocket, flipping it face inward so only the employee ID number showed. No photo. No name. No rank that didn't exist anymore. The fluorescent lights above the locker room ceiling hummed their monotonous frequency, a sound that had begun to feel like the metronome of civilian life. In Sangin, silence had been the rhythm. Silence was survival. Here, in Raleigh, silence just meant you were invisible. The ER at Mercy General sprawled across the East Wing like a controlled disaster perpetually 12 minutes away from chaos. 17 beds, 3 trauma bays, a waiting room that cycled through fever and panic on an 8-hour rotation. Rachel had learned the layout of the place the way soldiers learn a forward operating base, entrances, exits, pharmacy location, crash cart position, where the senior residents took their breaks. Spatial awareness wasn't about paranoia. It was about knowing where you stood when the room went sideways. And rooms went sideways. She clocked in at 10:58 p.m. and found the charge nurse, Margaret, standing at the central station with a vein-popping level of frustration written across her face. "You're the temp." Margaret didn't look up from the census board. Trauma Bay 3 just came in. GSW to the abdomen, 34-year-old male, trauma surgeons prepping now. Get yourself in there with Rodriguez. Don't touch anything without asking. Don't. I understand, Rachel said. Her voice was the voice of someone who'd learned to take orders in environments where misunderstanding meant someone died. Quiet. Measured. Flat. Margaret looked up then, and something in Rachel's composure registered as either very submissive or very prepared. She decided to read it as submissive. Good. Bay 3. Rachel moved toward the trauma bays with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, though she didn't look like she'd done this before. She looked like a temp nurse who'd maybe worked at a clinic or a walk-in urgent care. Forgettable. The kind of person who'd handle vitals and step back when the real doctors arrived. That was the entire architecture of her civilian existence: disappear into the background, be useful without being memorable, collect a paycheck, and touch the boots in her locker once per shift to remember who she actually was. Trauma Bay 3 smelled like copper and adrenaline, that specific chemical signature of fresh bleeding. The patient was already prepped, shirt cut away, abdomen exposed to the overhead lights. Dr. James Chen, the trauma surgeon, was reviewing imaging with the intensity of a man about to crack open a chest cavity. Dr. Hargrove was there too, standing near the window with his arms crossed, observing the way senior physicians observe, with the confidence of someone who delegated actual competence to people below him on the hospital hierarchy. Vitals? Chen didn't look away from the CT scans lit up on the monitor. BP 98/62, dropping, Rodriguez said, the resident whose hands were already moving through assessment. Pulsatile abdomen, tenderness at the left flank. Respiration shallow, 22. Rachel moved without being asked. She drew blood from the remaining accessible arm, her hand steady on the 18-gauge needle, drawing units for type and cross with the precision of someone who'd done this in conditions significantly more austere than a climate-controlled hospital. 2 vials. Rotation. Label. No hesitation. No fumbling. Just the fluid competence of muscle memory that didn't know how to stop being professional even when professionalism required erasing your own existence. Chen glanced sideways at her. Temp. Rachel, she said. Names were safer than titles. All right, Rachel. We're going straight to the OR. GSW tracking into the retroperitoneum. I need that blood moving to surgery stat. Rodriguez, you're prepping for open abdominal. Get me a 6-0 and 4-0 silk suture ready. We're looking at probable IVC repair. Rachel was already moving the patient toward the doors. She'd learned in Sangin that question slowed down necessary actions, and necessary actions kept people alive. Dr. Hargrove was still standing by the window, watching her with the peculiar intensity of a man noting something that didn't quite fit the pattern he expected. He saw a temp nurse in forgettable scrubs moving a critical patient to surgery. He didn't see anything remarkable about her. Not yet. But he filed away the moment like a man collecting evidence of something he didn't quite understand. The next 3 hours blurred into controlled chaos. 2 more traumas came in, a multi-vehicle accident on I-40, a fall from a construction site. Rachel moved between bays with the kind of seamless efficiency that made no sense for someone who'd worked temporary assignments. She anticipated needs before they were stated. She positioned equipment without being shown where it went. She had a conversation with Dr. Chen at 2:33 a.m. that would plant the first seed of suspicion. Get me the femoral approach for the reboa, Chen called out, and Rachel was already reaching for the vascular cart, hands moving to select the right balloon catheter before he finished the sentence. A Marine Corps veteran named Dr. Marcus Webb, working as a physician assistant, had been assisting with the debridement on the construction accident case. He was standing 2 feet from Rachel, and he watched her hands move through the tissue layers with the kind of surgical precision that had nothing to do with nursing school curriculum. She knew where to place her fingers to keep the field clear. She knew the depth of tissue planes. She knew how to move without creating a secondary injury that would require additional repair. She wasn't assisting. She was operating. Where'd you learn to cut like that? Webb asked. It wasn't a casual question. He was a Marine, and Marines knew the difference between training and instinct, between certification and actual operational experience. Because that's not nursing school. Rachel didn't pause. She was holding a retractor, keeping a surgical field open, and pausing mid-operation was the worst kind of distraction. YouTube, she said quietly. I watch a lot of instructional videos. Webb didn't believe her. But he also didn't press. There was something in the way she'd answered, the absolute flatness of delivery, the refusal to elaborate, that told him this was not a line of questioning with an accessible answer. He'd spent 6 years with the Marine Corps, and he recognized when someone had filed their background into compartments and locked the doors. So he didn't ask again. By 4:15 a.m., the ER had cycled into the quiet that came in the deep night, that specific window when the drunk drivers and the unconscious overdoses had either been admitted or stabilized or declared, and new chaos hadn't yet arrived. Rachel was restocking the trauma bays, replacing used supplies with methodical precision, when Dr. Hargrove appeared in the corridor. He moved like a man who owned the space, shoulders back, chin elevated, the specific bearing of someone who'd spent 15 years making sure everyone remembered his position on the hospital hierarchy. "Torres, isn't it?" He said her name like it was a minor detail he'd noted from the assignment board. "Yes, Dr. Hargrove." Rachel didn't look directly at him. She kept her eyes on the 4 cart she was organizing, because looking directly at senior physicians invited conversation, and conversation led to questions. "Temporary status." "Yes, sir." "Don't expect much from this assignment. We've had some issues with temp staff not maintaining standard protocols. Some of them think working in a hospital is the same as watching medical dramas." He smiled, and the smile had the quality of a man who'd made the same joke at someone else's expense and found it endlessly entertaining. "I assume you understand the difference." Rachel finished arranging the last fur line in its slot. 16 gauge, 18 gauge, 20 gauge, 22 gauge. Color-coded. Methodical. The kind of organization that came from people who'd assembled medical supplies in field conditions and never broken the habit of perfect arrangement. "I understand the difference, sir," she said. "Good. Try not to embarrass yourself too badly." Hargrove turned to leave, then paused, delivering the kind of dismissive comment he probably practiced in mirrors. "Though we both know temps always find a way. Stick to your lane, and we won't have problems." He walked away before she responded, which was intentional. Hargrove was an architect of power dynamics, and he understood that delivering insults while preventing reply was the most efficient way to establish dominance. Rachel watched his pressed white coat disappear down the corridor toward the physician's lounge, and she felt her left thumb twitch, the tremor, the involuntary reminder of Sangin, the physical evidence of a trauma that had no official name. She reached into her scrub pocket and touched the temporary badge, the one with no photograph and no name. Then she moved back to the locker room, because there was still an hour until her shift ended, and she'd learned long ago that movement was superior to stillness when your mind was processing insults that your voice wasn't allowed to address. The combat boots were waiting in the locker, worn and patient. She didn't touch them yet. But she thought about them. Boots that had walked through fire. Boots that had carried a person who'd saved lives in mountains where the maps didn't match the ground. Boots that had belonged to someone whose rank and service and every classified moment of sacrifice had been erased by a government handler telling her to disappear. But she was still here. Moving through Mercy General like a ghost. Working temp shifts like a person with nothing left to lose. And Dr. Hargrove had just made his first tactical error. He decided that Rachel Torres was beneath him, barely worth the effort of intimidation. The staff lounge at Mercy General smelled like burnt coffee and the particular kind of exhaustion that only a 14-hour shift could produce. 20 nurses crowded the space during shift change, residents perched on the edge of the sofa, night crew filtering in with that hollow-eyed hunger that meant they'd eaten nothing but vending machine coffee since midnight. Dr. Hargrove stood at the center of it all, because that's where he always stood, stirring his coffee with a silver spoon that probably cost more than Rachel's weekly paycheck. "I'll give the temp 2 weeks maximum," he announced, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who'd never been wrong about anything. "Actually, let's make it interesting." He paused, letting the room settle into attention. "I bet she quits within 1 week. Any takers?" Laughter rippled through the lounge like electricity through water. Someone whistled low. A resident snickered into her hand. Rachel stood at the corner sink, refilling her cracked mug, the one with the faded navy emblem that she'd somehow managed to keep through 2 years of temp assignments. She didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge the words. Her back remained straight. Her breathing remained measured. The tap water ran cold over her fingertips as she filled the mug to the rim, and she counted the beats of her own pulse to make sure it stayed even. "She's too quiet," Hargrove continued, addressing his audience the way a general might address troops. "Quiet people don't last in trauma. They fold under pressure. They cry in supply closets. Mark my words, 1 week. He stirred his coffee again, the spoon making small deliberate circles against the ceramic. Maybe less. Rachel dried her hands on a paper towel. Folded it into thirds. Threw it in the trash. She walked past the cluster of staff members without making eye contact, and for a moment, just a fraction of a second, the room quieted. Something in her stillness had registered. Something in the way her shoulders carried the weight of the bet without flinching. But Hargrove saw only what he wanted to see, a scared nurse who would be gone by Thursday. The cafeteria incident happened during afternoon rounds. Rachel was sitting alone at a corner table, nursing a plate of pasta and trying to eat something before her next trauma code. The marinara sauce smelled like garlic and something close to home, and she'd just taken her first bite when Hargrove approached from her blind side. He carried his own tray with deliberate slowness, his path intersecting with hers in a way that looked accidental to anyone who wasn't watching closely. He pretended to stumble. The tray came down hard. Pasta sauce exploded across Rachel's chest and lap, splashing up onto her neck in a warm, sticky constellation. Her silverware clattered on the tile floor in that particular metallic percussion that makes everyone look up. The plate shattered. Marinara pooled across the plastic table and dripped onto her scrubs like a prophecy of blood. "Terribly sorry, sweetheart," Hargrove said, "not sorry at all." His smile was the smile of a predator that didn't need to hide its teeth. "How clumsy of me." Other staff members looked away. They'd learned not to see things like this. Rachel remained seated for exactly 3 seconds, processing the assault through every nerve ending that had been trained by the military to recognize threat patterns. Then she stood slowly. Deliberately. She picked up the shattered plate pieces from the table. She gathered the silverware. She wiped the sauce from her scrubs with a paper napkin, and when she looked up, a single tear escaped from her left eye. Not from shame. From rage that couldn't be released. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. "It's fine, doctor. I've cleaned up worse messes than this." Her voice was quiet. Measured. The kind of quiet that carries more weight than shouting. The kind of quiet that makes your spine understand, on an instinctual level, that you're in the presence of someone who survived things that would have destroyed you. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected that response. He'd expected tears, apologies, the crumbling of someone beneath the weight of public humiliation. Instead, Rachel was already moving to the trash, disposing of the broken plate pieces, cleaning the table with the efficiency of someone who'd been trained to operate in chaos. By the time she sat back down, her hands were steady. Her breathing hadn't changed. Her cracked mug was still in her hand, waiting. He walked away first. The third strike came during evening rounds. A patient's family member had complained about pain medication timing, and Hargrove had decided to make an example. He arrived at Rachel's station holding a patient chart, not the one in question, just one he grabbed at random from the desk. The charge nurse was there, 3 medical students, 2 residents. Witnesses. Always witnesses, because Hargrove understood that humiliation required an audience. He threw the chart at Rachel's feet. The metal clipboard hit the linoleum floor with a crack that echoed through the entire ward. The sound was deliberate. Calculated. Every eye in the immediate vicinity shifted toward the source of the noise. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying that syrup-smooth condescension that made every woman in earshot feel something twist in their chest. His arms were crossed. His weight was shifted back on his heels in that posture of absolute certainty. The smirk was already there, already secure in the knowledge that she would obey. Rachel crouched. Retrieved the chart. The metal was cool against her fingertips, and she noticed the specific details of the moment with the kind of clinical precision that came from survival training, the fluorescent lights humming above her at 60 hertz, the distant beep of a cardiac monitor from a room 4 doors down, the smell of antiseptic overlaid with something like fear sweat from the medical students who were watching to see what she would do. She stood to her full height. Held the chart at her side. Took one measured breath. "I've picked up heavier things than your ego, doctor," she said quietly. The words were soft enough that only those closest heard them clearly, but that was the point. The charge nurse's head snapped up. One of the residents coughed into his fist. Hargrove's expression shifted, not anger exactly, but something closer to recognition, like he'd just realized he was holding a live grenade and wasn't quite sure how it got into his hand. Something in Rachel's eyes had changed. Something that existed in a register he didn't have access to. Something that had seen things that would have destroyed ordinary people. His instinct was to look away first, and he did, but looking away only made him angrier because anger was easier than fear, and fear was the correct response to whatever had just looked back at him from behind a temp nurse's name badge. That night, after his shift ended, Hargrove sat in his office with the door closed and started making calls. His first call went to the hospital board treasurer, a man who owed him 3 favors for various administrative assistants over the past decade. "I need documentation," Hargrove said into the phone. "Credential verification. Routine housekeeping." His second call went to the nursing school where Rachel's credentials supposedly originated, a casual inquiry about whether her licensure status had ever been flagged. His third call was to an investigator he'd used before, someone who understood how to document concerning patterns and scope of practice violations in ways that could withstand scrutiny. But that wasn't the real problem, and Hargrove knew it. The real problem was that a Special Forces major had arrived via helicopter medevac 3 days earlier, and Rachel Torres had spent 6 hours in the trauma bay demonstrating a level of surgical competence that should not have existed in someone with a nursing degree. The major came in at 2:53 a.m., airlifted from the field with shrapnel wounds that looked like someone had tried to rewrite his anatomy with an IED blast. His torso was decorated with entry wounds, constellation patterns that told a specific story to anyone trained to read that particular language. Rachel was assigned to assist during debridement, and the moment she saw the wound architecture, something shifted in her bearing. Her hands moved forward before her brain could catch up, muscle memory taking over from a part of her that hadn't been used in 2 years. She was already calculating tissue layers, tracking the shrapnel migration path through muscle fascia. Her fingers worked with a surgical precision that made the attending physician pause mid-instruction, his scalpel stopping an inch above the major's chest. "I've got the bleeder," Rachel said, her voice shifting into a register she hadn't used since Sangin. The command voice. The voice that moved through firefights and trauma bays where rank didn't exist and survival did. She isolated a severed vessel with a vascular clamp, her touch certain and deliberate, and tied it off in seconds flat. A physician assistant working the opposite side of the table, a man named Torres, former Marine Corps combat medic, watched the movement and recognition flickered across his face. During instrument handoff, he leaned closer, his voice dropping low so only Rachel could hear. "Where'd you learn to cut like that? Because that's not nursing school. That's forward surgical." Rachel's left thumb started trembling. Just the thumb. Just enough for someone who'd been trained to recognize shock responses. Just lucky hands, she deflected, but Torres didn't believe her. He'd seen those hands before, in field hospitals where rank didn't matter because everyone was too busy trying to keep someone alive to care about the org chart. The major stabilized and got moved to ICU. Rachel checked his chart 3 times during her break, her eyes tracking the shrapnel extraction notes like she was reading a language only her hands knew. Hargrove noticed. He always noticed when things didn't fit the narrative he'd constructed. And then he started asking questions that didn't have answers, which meant she was lying, which meant she was vulnerable, which meant he finally understood how to push her off the ladder she'd somehow managed to climb while staying invisible. The helicopter circled Mercy General's landing pad at 0247 hours, rotors cutting the pre-dawn darkness like a blade through silk. The major came down on a stretcher, his torso wrapped in field dressings already saturated through, his left shoulder hanging at an angle that meant shrapnel, meant blast fragmentation, meant IED. The kind of wound that looked survivable until it wasn't. Rachel was already moving before the ER doors opened, the sound of that rotor wash still vibrating through the hospital steel frame, and she understood what most of the night shift hadn't yet processed: this wasn't a routine trauma. This was a priority one who'd been airlifted from a forward operating base, which meant the wound was bad enough that a Black Hawk ride was faster than waiting for ground evacuation. 12 minutes airborne. That was how long he'd survived since the blast. Dr. Hargrove was in the trauma bay when they rolled the stretcher in, his tie already loosened, his posture shifted into the version of himself he believed made him indispensable. The Major's vitals came off the monitor like a countdown clock, blood pressure 94/61 and dropping, heart rate 118, respiratory rate 24, oxygen saturation 88 even on high flow. The field medic's report crackled from the flight paramedic: traumatic amputation of left index and middle finger, penetrating shrapnel wounds across the left anterior chest wall, possible pneumothorax, possible hemothorax, possible cardiac involvement, patient conscious and alert during transport. Rachel caught the last phrase and understood what it meant. The Major was awake. He knew how close he was to not waking up again. "Get him to imaging," Hargrove commanded, his voice pitched to fill the room, to remind everyone that he controlled what happened next. The nurses moved in practiced formation, cutting away the field dressings, exposing the wound landscape, jagged lacerations across his chest that looked like something had tried to carve through him and only partially succeeded. The shrapnel had entered at an angle, tearing tissue layers that Rachel's eyes catalogued automatically: superficial fascia first, then pectoral muscle, the wound tract suggesting deeper penetration. She was assigned to assist with the initial assessment and debridement, which meant she would be the one actually examining the wound while Hargrove directed traffic and took notes. The irony lived in the unspoken rules of hospital hierarchy: the person doing the technical work received the credit attached to someone else's name. The debridement started at 0314 hours, the lights in the trauma bay bright enough to bleach shadows out of existence. Rachel wore sterile gloves now, her hands moving through the tissue layers with the kind of precision that didn't come from nursing school textbooks. She knew what damaged tissue looked like when the damage came from ordnance rather than disease. She knew how to separate viable tissue from what the body would reject. She knew the angle to cut that minimized additional trauma. The Marine Corps veteran physician assistant, the one who'd asked her that first day where she'd learned to cut like that, was watching from the corner of the bay, and she felt his attention settle on her like weight. She didn't look up. Looking up was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement was the beginning of questions. "The blast pattern suggests a shaped charge," she said quietly, not to the room but to Hargrove, who was standing closer now, his clipboard held like a shield. "Penetration angle is consistent with IED placement beneath a vehicle." She was delivering information as if reading from the patient's chart, not offering her own assessment. The distinction mattered. Assessment required knowledge she wasn't supposed to possess. Information was just observation. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "How would you know the placement pattern from wound characteristics?" Rachel's hands didn't stop moving. "The literature on blast mechanics is well documented, Doctor. Published research. Available to anyone with access to a medical database." It was a lie wrapped in technical accuracy, the kind of lie that felt like truth if you quoted authority correctly. The published research existed. She just hadn't read it in any database. She'd lived it. The Major stabilized by 0 for 31 hours, his vitals climbing back into ranges where the monitor didn't sound quite so insistent. The chest tube drained 240 milliliters of frank blood, confirming the hemothorax Rachel had suspected from the muffled heart sounds and the distended neck veins visible even before the full examination. By the time the sun started breaking the eastern edge of Raleigh's sky, he was sedated, intubated, stable enough to move to ICU. The kind of stable that meant not dead yet, which in trauma care was everything. Hargrove wrote his note at 0510 hours, standing at the computer terminal with the attending surgeon, his voice carrying through the morning quiet of the unit. Excellent clinical decision-making on the hemothorax recognition. Swift intervention prevented deterioration into tamponade. He didn't mention Rachel's hands doing the actual work. He didn't mention her voice suggesting the chest tube placement that saved the Major's life. The note would read as if Hargrove had personally identified the problem, personally understood the pathophysiology, personally orchestrated the solution. Rachel knew this already. She'd seen it happen 100 times before, competence flowing upward, credit attaching to titles, names disappearing from the narrative of their own expertise. What happened next changed everything. The second night, the Major's monitor started alarming at 0306 hours. Rachel was passing the ICU room when the sound registered, not the standard beeping of a pressure fluctuation, but the urgent cascade of alarms that meant something had moved from concerning her to immediately life-threatening. She pushed through the doors before the code team had assembled, before the charge nurse could even call out. The Major's blood pressure had collapsed to 48/32. His heart rate was 142 and climbing. His neck veins were distended, his breathing shallow despite the ventilator pushing air into his lungs at 16 breaths per minute. The ventilator's own pressure alarm was sounding now, resistance increasing, which meant the air had somewhere to go and was being resisted by something fluid or solid filling the space around the heart. Cardiac tamponade. Blood accumulating in the pericardial sac, crushing the heart, preventing it from filling properly, turning a functioning organ into a trapped thing struggling against its own surrounding pressure. Rachel had seen this once before, in Sangin, when a patient coded because nobody understood that sometimes trauma surgeons miss the small bleeds that cause big problems later. She moved without being asked, without waiting for authorization, without following the chain of command that suddenly felt much less important than the fact that the Major was dying in front of her in a way that had a 30-second solution if someone was willing to take it. Hargrove emerged from the back office, still tucking his shirt in, clearly annoyed at the interruption of whatever he'd been doing. He saw the monitor, saw the vital signs, and his first response was procedural rather than decisive. Get the ultrasound. We need to confirm tamponade before we do anything aggressive. Rachel was already pulling the crash cart closer, her hands moving on their own, the kind of muscle memory that transcends choice. The cardiac needle was a 16-gauge, long enough to reach the pericardial space, and she knew exactly where to insert it, the subxiphoid approach, just below the xiphoid process, angling toward the left shoulder at 45 degrees. Hargrove was still fumbling with the ultrasound machine, still trying to see what Rachel already knew from the clinical presentation. The distended neck veins. The muffled heart sounds. The precipitous drop in pressure without hemorrhagic evidence. The math was simple. The solution was simpler. We need a pericardiocentesis now, Rachel said, her voice dropping the inflection that had characterized every other interaction with Hargrove. Not a request. A statement. A fact presented as urgently necessary because it was. I'll do it when I'm ready, Hargrove snapped, his fingers still moving across the ultrasound keyboard, trying to achieve certainty before acting. The kind of caution that looked professional until the patient died while you were looking for confirmation. The monitor showed pressures falling, 88/40 now, the oxygen saturation beginning to drop because the Major's heart couldn't pump blood to his lungs effectively anymore. Rachel made a choice that split her life into before and after, the same kind of choice she'd made in Sangin when following orders meant watching people die. She grabbed the cardiac needle, prepped the subxiphoid area with chlorhexidine in 10 seconds, let her hands find the anatomical landmarks that didn't require ultrasound confirmation because they were written in the body itself. The needle advanced at the exact 45-degree angle, through skin, through fascia, through the pericardial membrane, and then the resistance changed. She was in the space where blood had collected and pooled. Stop, Hargrove shouted from across the bay. You don't have authorization. Rachel drew back on the syringe. 60 milliliters of blood came out in the first pull. Dark. Thick. The accumulated pressure of hours of slow bleeding from the shrapnel wound's deeper vessels finally reaching critical mass. She kept drawing. 80 milliliters. The monitor was still showing pressure dropping, but the sound of the resistance easing, the physical sensation of pressure releasing in her hands, told her the tamponade was releasing, the blood crushing the heart was being evacuated. 100 milliliters. The Major gasped, his sedation wearing thin enough that pain reached him, consciousness flickering at the edges. The monitor flatlined for 3 seconds. The universe held its breath. Then the rhythm returned, a sinus rhythm, steady, the heart filling properly again, the pressure beginning to climb back toward survivable ranges. The Major gasped, his eyes fluttering open, awareness returning as the oxygen reached his brain again. He was alive. That was the only fact that mattered, and it lived in direct opposition to everything Hargrove had done and failed to do. Hargrove didn't thank her. He stepped back into the hallway without speaking, without acknowledgement, and Rachel understood that she'd just crossed a line from invisible to threatening. She continued filling the pericardial space with sterile saline, continuing to stabilize the intervention, performing the technical medicine while Hargrove's presence withdrew into something colder, something calculating. The 3 calls came within the next hour. The charge nurse saw him on the phone in the administrative office, saw the door close, saw the kind of focus that suggested something institutional was being mobilized. The first call went to the hospital board treasurer, a man who'd needed Hargrove's silence about a medication error that had nearly killed a patient 3 years ago. Debts had memory in places like Mercy General. The second call went to the nursing board office in Raleigh, Hargrove's voice pitched for concern rather than accusation. "I need to verify the credentials of one of our temporary nursing staff." "Rachel Torres." "Yes, that's the name." "I'm concerned about scope of practice violations." "Yes, during patient care." "I'd appreciate it if you could contact her school directly." The third call was to an administrative investigator he'd used before, a man who specialized in documenting patterns of behavior that looked concerning when arranged in the right sequence, when presented by someone with authority making the presentation. By 05:47 hours, the investigation was triggered. By 06:30 hours, Rachel's termination letter was drafted in legal's offices. By 0700 hours, when the day shift arrived and took over the ICU, Rachel was being escorted out by security, her employment terminated for performing procedures outside her licensure scope and insubordination during critical incident. The words on the paper were technically true, which made them devastatingly effective. She stopped at her locker, hand steady even as her chest tightened with the peculiar violence of being erased twice. The cardboard box, the security guard had brought her one from the supply closet, was empty and waiting. The cracked mug. The dying succulent she'd tried to keep alive for 3 months. The photograph of her SEAL team before Sangin, before the mission that had classified her out of existence the first time. She looked at their faces for a long moment, these 7 people who'd been family and were now officially phantoms, whose names would never appear in any official capacity again. Then she wrapped the combat boots, the worn ones, the one she'd carried through 2 years of hiding, in her spare scrubs like a body bag. She didn't move quickly. She didn't move with emotion. She moved like someone who'd been trained for this, who understood that falling apart was a luxury for people with futures that weren't being dismantled in real time. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with their particular frequency, that sound that only existed in hospitals and prisons and government buildings, the frequency of places designed to contain human suffering. She locked her locker one last time and walked toward the exit, the cardboard box pressed against her chest, her security escort maintaining professional distance exactly 3 steps behind. Outside, rain had started falling. Hard rain. The kind that soaked through cardboard within seconds. She stood in the parking lot at 0716 hours, watching the box absorb water, watching the corner begin to fail, and understood that disappearing twice was a particular kind of punishment. The first time, it had been mission security. This time, it was supposed to be permanent. The monitor alarm split the ICU silence like shattered glass. 0247 hours. The major's heart rate climbing, 142. 156, 168, then dropping in a way that made every experienced nurse in the ward recognize the signature pattern of cardiac tamponade. His BP collapsed to 70 systolic. Then lower. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as his oxygen saturation began its fatal descent. Rachel was 3 floors down, charting in the break room with lukewarm coffee going cold beside her, when the overhead came through. Code blue. ICU 4. Her hands moved before her mind caught up. Muscle memory took over. She was moving toward the elevators as the code team scrambled, her feet hitting the tile in a rhythm that belonged to someone who'd run toward gunfire before, who understood that hesitation measured itself in lives. The ICU doors burst open at her approach. The major lay exposed on the bed, his chest rising and falling with the ventilator's mechanical compliance, his monitor showing a rhythm that belonged to a dying man. His heart rate had tanked to 42. His systolic pressure was 58 and falling. The entire team stood frozen around him like statues, residents checking the ultrasound screen, the attending calling out orders that didn't matter because they weren't solving the problem. Dr. Hargrove stood at the foot of the bed with a portable ultrasound probe in his trembling hands, fumbling with the transducer, his voice climbing an octave with each incomprehensible order. "Get me a pericardiocentesis kit," he was saying, but his voice lacked authority. His hands weren't steady. He was trying to read the ultrasound screen like it was written in a language he'd forgotten. Rachel didn't ask permission. She moved to the bedside crash cart, her hands fluid and certain, and pulled open the trauma tray, 14-gauge angiocath needle, sterile gloves, 10 cubic centimeters syringe. Her fingers found the landmarks on the major's chest without hesitation, the xiphoid process, the left costal margin, the angle that meant entry below and lateral, the precise point where fluid crushing a warrior's heart could be drained in the time it took most people to blink. "Step back," she said. Not a request. A command delivered in a voice that carried the weight of a rank no one here understood she held. Dr. Hargrove opened his mouth. Closed it. "Step back." Rachel's breath steadied. Her hands moved like they'd performed this procedure 100 times, because they had, in places the government would never admit existed. The needle went in at a 30-degree angle, moving past the pleura, feeling for the give, the subtle resistance that meant she'd entered the pericardial space. 40 seconds. That's all it took. The syringe filled with blood, dark red, viscous, the physical proof that the major's own heart was drowning him. She drew 200 cubic centimeters of fluid, and the major's heart rate began to climb. 68, 78, 88, normal sinus rhythm returned to the monitor like a bell being rung in a cathedral. The blood pressure came back. 98/62. Stable. Viable. Alive. The room exhaled. Nurses began moving again, one of them whispering something that sounded like a prayer. Dr. Hargrove stood at the foot of the bed with the ultrasound probe still in his hands, his face the color of institutional beige, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from its tank. Rachel removed her gloves and placed them carefully in the medical waste container. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. She didn't accept the gratitude she could feel hovering in the air like humidity before a storm. She simply turned and walked toward the medication room, knowing that what had just happened would echo, that the performance she'd given, the surgical precision, the authority, the knowledge that shouldn't have belonged to a temp nurse named Rachel from nowhere, had just exposed her in a way that couldn't be unseen. Dr. Hargrove didn't come to the medication room. He didn't approach her during rounds. He simply disappeared into his administrative office at 0251 hours, and Rachel felt the predatory focus of his attention like a target being painted across her back. The first call came at 0307 hours. She heard about it from the charge nurse 30 minutes later. Dr. Hargrove called the hospital board treasurer, David Kirkland. Something about reviewing staff credentials. Rachel's stomach remained steady even as the words fell like dominoes. Then he called your nursing school, St. Augustine's, right? Asking questions about your background. And then the charge nurse's voice dropped. And then he called someone from administration about filing a formal complaint regarding scope of practice violations. Rachel continued charting. Her handwriting didn't waver. Her hands didn't shake. Did he specify which violations? The pericardiocentesis. He's saying you performed an invasive procedure without proper licensure to do so. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Rachel set down her pen and spoke in a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere very deep and very cold. I've picked up heavier things than his ego, Doctor. By 0600 hours, Dr. Hargrove had completed his work. He'd activated a network he'd spent 15 years building, the board treasurer who owed him a favor, the administrative investigator he'd used before to document concerning patterns of insubordination. He'd positioned himself perfectly, moving from victim of her dangerous incompetence to concerned supervisor protecting hospital liability. By the time the hospital's legal department woke up, the narrative was already written. The temp nurse had exceeded her scope of practice, had endangered a patient by performing a procedure outside her credentials, and represented an unacceptable risk. The security escort arrived at 0705 hours, 2 officers in blue windbreakers who looked apologetic and professional. "We need you to come with us," they said, not unkindly. Rachel had packed before they arrived, the cardboard box already containing the essentials she'd kept in her locker. The pair of worn combat boots from Sangin, the soles creased from 2 years of patrols in terrain that would eat normal boots alive. The cracked mug her SEAL team had given her before the operation that erased them. A dying succulent she'd been failing to keep alive for 3 months. And the photograph, her unit before the mission, 6 faces smiling at the camera, not knowing that 4 of those faces would stop existing after Sangin. "You're being terminated for performing procedures outside your current licensure level," the HR representative explained, a woman named Susan who couldn't quite maintain eye contact. "This is effective immediately. We can offer you 2-week severance and a neutral reference regarding your employment." Rachel listened. She signed the termination papers. She didn't argue or appeal. She simply took the box and walked toward the exit, the weight of it settling against her ribs like another kind of armor. The rain started as soon as she stepped into the parking lot. Not gentle precipitation, but the kind of rain that came sideways, that soaked through clothing in minutes, that turned cardboard fragile and weak. She sat at the bus stop bench across the street, watching the hospital entrance where the major still lay recovering, where the team would be examining her pericardiocentesis in the medical record, where Dr. Hargrove was probably calling the board treasurer again to ensure she couldn't be rehired anywhere in the system. The box disintegrated slowly. The photograph ink began to blur, the faces she'd carried for 2 years starting to fade, the ghosts becoming even more ghostly. The succulent soil turned to mud. The boots remained solid but darkened with moisture. Rachel stared at the soaked pavement and felt the particular weight of a second erasure, understanding that there were only so many times a person could disappear before they stopped being real, before they became something like smoke, visible but untouchable, present but powerless. The major would recover. She'd saved his life. And in saving it, she'd ended her own disguise, revealed capabilities that no temp nurse should have possessed, painted a target across her back so bright that no administrative system could ignore it. Twice now she'd been erased. Twice she'd been unmade by the people she'd served. The rain fell harder, and Rachel waited for the bus with a cardboard box falling to pieces in her lap, wondering if there was a limit to how many times you could be destroyed before destruction itself became your only constant. The rain fell like bullets against the cardboard box, each drop punching through the wet fibers. Rachel sat on the bench at the transit station across from Mercy General, the hospital's lit windows blurring behind sheets of water, and watched the photograph of her SEAL team begin to curl at the edges. 7 faces. All of them supposed to be gone, officially erased, classified into nothing. She'd accepted that erasure for years ago in Sangin. She'd made peace with being unmade. But this was different. This was a second death, and she hadn't volunteered for it. The succulent in the cardboard box was already drowning. Brown, brittle leaves disintegrating into wet soil. It had lasted 3 weeks on the ER break room windowsill before Dr. Hargrove made a comment about her attempt to keep something alive, as if even that small mercy was beneath a temp nurse's position. She'd kept it anyway. Some things you keep not because they'll survive, but because keeping them is the only way you know you're still trying. 36 minutes. That's how long the pericardiocentesis had taken to go from saving a life to ending her career. 36 minutes between the moment the monitor beat back to life and the moment security walked her to the door with a cardboard box that smelled like bleach and broken promises. Rachel pulled the photograph out of the box before the rain could destroy it completely. The lamination held. 8 inches by 10 inches, that was all, 7 operators and 1 woman in the center, back before the mission that unmade them all. Before Sangin. Before the Taliban fighter she'd carried on her back for 3 miles under fire. Before the Bronze Star she was never supposed to mention, the Navy and Marine Corps medal that didn't exist in any official capacity, the Purple Heart that came with a handler's instruction that she no longer existed in any database. She'd spent 2 years convincing herself that disappearing was a kind of freedom. No name, no record, no past. Just hands that worked and eyes that stayed forward and a uniform she'd left folded at the bottom of a duffel bag in a storage unit in Chapel Hill. Now she sat in the rain with everything she owned in a soggy box, and she understood the geometry of erasure. There were different ways to be unmade. The Pentagon had done it clean. Dr. Hargrove had done it cruel. The bus didn't come for 47 minutes. Rachel watched the hospital's parking lot. The night shift beginning. New faces arriving to replace her. New temp nurses coming to work their hours and keep their heads down, the way she'd tried to. Some of them would last. Some would figure out quickly that the hierarchy at Mercy General was a pyramid designed to crush anyone who stood out, anyone who asked the wrong questions, anyone too competent to be safely controlled. The thermometer on the bus shelter read 51 degrees. Rachel's scrubs were soaked through. Hypothermia was 16 minutes away if she did the math, but she'd done worse math than this. She'd calculated survival odds in the Helmand province with bullet holes in her shoulder. She could handle rain and a folded-up cardboard box. 2 years. That's what she allowed herself. 2 years was an acceptable amount of time for everything to realign, for the pieces to settle, for the truth to finally crack through the surface like shrapnel working its way out of skin. The Major spent those 2 years searching. He spent them in rehabilitation, relearning how to walk without a limp, how to grip a steering wheel without his right hand shaking, how to sleep without waking at 3 a.m. with his heart rate climbing. The IED had nearly killed him. The shrapnel had lodged 3 centimeters from his femoral artery. The cardiac tamponade would have stopped his heart completely if she hadn't performed that procedure in 40 seconds. He knew these facts the way he knew his own call sign. He knew them the way you know your own bones. He started with hospital records. Cross-referenced temp nursing agencies with the dates he was admitted to Mercy General. Found the gaps in employment history that matched the gaps in official databases. Found a woman named Rachel Torres who'd worked in the ER on 3 separate occasions, always nights, always temporary, always leaving no forwarding address. His Navy SEAL command didn't ask why he was searching. They knew. They'd seen the surveillance footage from the Sangin compound. They had the after-action reports, the declassified statements from the 3 hostages, the medical evaluation that documented how Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres had moved through a war zone with her hands bleeding through tactical gloves, carrying a man who weighed more than she did, 43 minutes of contact that ended with all 3 hostages breathing and 1 Navy SEAL missing her already. The Major arrived at Mercy General on a Tuesday morning in October. The rain had stopped by then. The hospital's parking lot was full, the morning shift change happening, and in Trauma Bay 4, a refugee patient with acute kidney failure was being admitted to ICU. His name was Rashid Karimi. He'd escaped the Taliban 4 years ago, spent 2 years in a refugee camp, and got asylum status 3 months back. He was dying by centimeters, his kidneys failing, his urine output dropping, his electrolytes climbing toward cardiac arrest. The nephrologist had given him a window of maybe 8 weeks before he'd need dialysis or death, whichever came first. Rachel walked past his room to check the blood draw on a post-op coronary bypass patient 2 doors down. She was pushing a medication cart, her movements efficient and automatic, the muscle memory of someone who'd trained for this the way athletes trained for the Olympics, with precision, with purpose, with the understanding that hesitation costs lives. Rashid Karimi saw her in the hallway. He screamed. Pashto tore out of his throat like something alive, like something that had been waiting for years for this exact moment. His body convulsed in the ICU bed, his monitors alarming, his foreline nearly dislodging as he pointed at Rachel with a trembling finger. His English was scattered, fragmented, but his Pashto was crystal clear. Malalai. Malalai. The name his unit had given her. The American Shadow. The woman who'd run through fire that shouldn't have been survivable, who'd extracted 3 men from a compound that was supposed to be impenetrable, who'd carried him personally, his arm across her shoulders, her blood mixing with his blood on the medical tape that held his dressing together. Malalai. Malalai. You are alive. You are alive. Rachel froze. For 2.7 seconds. That was all. The hospital interpreter rushed into the room, confused, asking for context in Dari. The monitors screamed. The patient's blood pressure was climbing toward a hypertensive crisis. Rachel's hands were steady when she moved to the bedside and checked his full line, but her breathing had changed. The air was moving differently through her lungs. Someone who wasn't paying attention wouldn't notice. Someone trained would see it immediately. The major stepped forward from the observation window. His uniform was crisp. His medals hung in perfect rows. His voice dropped into the frequency that made people move without thinking. Senior Chief Petty Officer. It wasn't a question. It was a recall to duty. Rachel's hand stilled on the medication cart. The world shifted. Gravity changed direction. A Navy SEAL commander entered the ICU behind the major, his presence moving through the room like a pressure change before a storm. He was tall in the way that certain powerful people are tall, not just in inches but in the space they took up, the air they displaced, the way the fluorescent light seemed to dim slightly around him. His uniform bore the insignia of command, and his voice when he spoke carried the weight of authority that transcended rank. Senior Chief Torres, he said, and it sounded like a name being restored to existence. 2 bronze stars with Valor device for actions under fire. Navy and Marine Corps Medal. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. He said each medal separately. He gave each one its own beat, its own silence, its own moment for the hospital staff to understand what they were looking at. Rachel stood motionless, her hand still on the fall line, her eyes forward, her breathing controlled. The voice transformation happened without sound. The trembling nurse from 2 years ago was gone. What stood there now was something older, something harder, something that had learned to survive by being invisible. An FBI liaison entered the trauma bay with a tablet and federal authority written across her face like a scar. Senior Chief Torres, your classified operation in Sangin has been declassified as of 0600 hours this morning. Your naval record has been restored. Your security clearance is active. Any individual or institution that took adverse action against a protected military operative will face federal review and potential criminal charges under the Defense Contractor Accountability Act. The room went silent. The monitors still beeped. The ventilators still wheezed. But human sound stopped. Human movement stopped. Only Rachel moved, her hand releasing the fall line with the kind of precise care that suggested she'd been holding it together by pure force of will. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the ICU doorway. His white coat was pristine. His composure was already cracking. He tried to regain narrative control, to reassert the hierarchy he'd spent 15 years climbing. Now, let's discuss this through proper channels. Hospital protocols. Dr. Hargrove, a voice interrupted from the opposite doorway. The IT specialist, a quiet Army veteran named Clayton who worked in the basement rebuilding computers and nursing systems, held up a flash drive. I preserved the security footage from the night of the pericardiocentesis. Video files, metadata, timestamps. Also your attempt to delete them on file 37A. Also the email chain where you instructed me to corrupt the backup systems. Clayton's voice was steady. Professional. The kind of calm that comes from having already won. Federal investigators are upstairs with your personnel file right now. Your phone records. Your email. Your call logs to the board treasurer, the nursing school, and Richard Crane from administrative investigations. The room shifted again. Gravity didn't just change direction, it inverted completely. Everything Dr. Hargrove had built, every connection he'd weaponized, every favor he'd called in, every piece of his institutional power had become a liability the moment he tried to destroy someone the Pentagon needed protected. 18 months later, someone spotted him at a strip mall outside Raleigh. The place had the desperate quality of marginal retail, the anchor store was gone, the parking lot half empty, and in front of a defunct Payless shoe store sat a folding table with a banner reading Supplemental Insurance Policies, Ask Me How. His white coat was gone. His specialty certifications were gone. His hospital privileges, his board memberships, his medical license, all gone, suspended under federal review, and by the time the review finished, his reputation was so contaminated that no medical board in 3 states would reinstate him. He sat at that folding table in the rain, hands pale from not wearing latex gloves anymore, trying to convince people to buy insurance policies he didn't understand and couldn't sell. The major walked past that table twice. Both times he left a dollar bill on the corner, and both times he didn't make eye contact. Mercy General held a dedication ceremony 63 days after the reveal. The newly renamed Rachel Torres Trauma Unit was standing room only, hospital staff in formal attire, military personnel in dress uniforms, the 3 hostages from Sangin participating via secure video link, their faces projected on screens large enough that the entire auditorium could see them as they spoke 30-second testimonies about how Rachel had carried them through fire. Rachel stood at the podium in dress whites for the first time in 4 years. The uniform fit like it had never left her body. Her insignia was restored. Her ribbons hung in perfect rows, Bronze Star with Valor device first, then Navy and Marine Corps medal, then Purple Heart, then Purple Heart. The medals didn't catch the light like they should have. They absorbed it. They looked like they'd been carried through actual fire, because they had. The major stood beside her with a shadow box containing her worn combat boots, now polished to mirror shine, mounted above a plaque that read, "Some heroes hide in plain sight for 2 years, waiting for the truth to find them." Rashid Karimi sat in the front row, his dialysis port visible where his shirt collar opened, tears streaming down his weathered face as he whispered Malalaya like a prayer. Rachel's speech was brief. Her voice was steady. She spoke the way someone speaks who has already survived worse than public judgment, who has already been erased and restored, who understands that heroism isn't measured in ribbons, it's measured in the seconds you move when movement costs everything. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You need only the courage to do what's right when the cost is high and the witnesses are few. The applause moved through the auditorium like shock wave. Behind the podium, the major stepped forward and opened the shadow box. Rachel touched the boots one final time, her hand steady, her breathing controlled, her presence commanding the room the way the most powerful people do, not by taking up space, but by making space meaningful. Outside in the parking lot, the rain had started again. The folding table near the strip mall would remain empty. Some erasures, once reversed, stay reversed. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do. This channel is dedicated to stories about the ones we underestimate, the quiet people who carry impossible strength, the heroes we walk past every day without knowing what they've survived. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who you really were. And let me know, would you have saved him, or walked away?